Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I would like to start by thanking the clerks and the staff of the Scottish Parliament Public Audit Committee for their support in compiling this detailed report. It documents a shocking series of bad decisions and poor practice, culminating in 2 ferries, 3 times over budget and 5 years late. Ferries which have still to set sail, one of which it would now be cheaper to scrap and start all over again. Long-established procurement processes simply not followed. A story of key decisions not being properly recorded, of ministers failing to account for the decisions they took, of key documents going missing, of the ministerial code broken, the biggest blank cheque in the history of the Scottish Parliament being written, standard maritime construction processes dismissed, financial safeguards and standard builders' refund guarantees simply disregarded. I will take an intervention.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Coffey, for taking an intervention. Just on the point of the blank cheque, surely the biggest blank cheque was actually the building of this Parliament, and when actually the SNP weren't in power.
I said this Parliament. You might have realised the blank cheque was written, in that case, before the building of this Parliament. So on that basis, there is no point there. This government wrote the biggest blank cheque in the history of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament, and the people are now paying the price. This is a story of an SNP government failing to respond time and time again, openly and transparently, to legitimate questions. And regrettably, and I say this regrettably, this is also a story of SNP members of the Public Audit Committee blatantly seeking to undermine this report in a cynical bid to get their ministers off the hook. And all the while, it is Scotland's island communities who are paying the price. Deputy Presiding Officer, let me turn to Audit Scotland's original report of March 2022. That report made clear that Scottish ministers approved the contract award to Ferguson Marine Engineering Limited in October 2015. They did so despite knowing the significant risks caused by FML's inability to provide mandatory refund guarantees, and also set against the severe misgivings of CMAL. As Scotland's impartial Auditor-General has said, there is insufficient evidence to explain why Scottish ministers made that decision. And, Presiding Officer, the worst part of all of this is that no minister has come to this Parliament to take responsibility for the tragic comedy of errors that has unfolded. So let's look at some of the evidence that we took and some of the key conclusions of the report. Jim McCall told us that the ferries being built at Ferguson's are, quotes, obsolete and will spew out what he described as poisonous gases. Morag McNeill, the interim chair of CMAL, told us that the preferred bidder announcement risked the entire procurement process. She said, and I quote, "Our preference was for that to be done on a confidential basis and for there not to be a public announcement." The former Transport Minister, Derek Mackay, admitted that there had been a catastrophic failure at the shipyard. Colleagues will know that this report was not agreed with the unanimous support of the committee, and that is regrettable. In public, and perpetually, and sometimes petulantly in private, SNP committee members chose to dismiss the evidence which was clear and which was overwhelming. A close examination of the report reveals that some of the core conclusions that Mr Beattie and Mr Coffey sought to delete or dilute. For example, Richard Leonard proposed that additional wording be added to refer to the poor judgment shown by Derek Mackay and to reflect that the integrity of the procurement process had been compromised. Instead...
Point of order, Claire Hockey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you for taking this point of order without any notice. I'm quite concerned that Mr Hoy appears to be putting on record or quoting things that happened in a private session in a committee, and I'm seeking your guidance on whether that's permissible.
Please, I thank Claire Hockey for her point of order. I did wonder myself, but it's not entirely clear to me what the facts are and whether or not Mr Hoy is referring to a private session of the committee, and perhaps Mr Hoy could elucidate the matter.
I'm referring to the appendix of the report that has the breakdown of the divisions that took place at each point, and in which case each motion that was put before the committee is in the final report. So I'm quoting from the final report. And the appendices, I'm afraid the appendices, you're going to have to listen to them because the appendices are littered with further examples. In relation to Keith Brown's shocking attempt to dodge scrutiny by repeatedly stonewalling legitimate questions from this... yes, a good question. Where is the former Deputy First Minister? Where is the former First Minister? Where is Mr Brown? They're not here. Instead, they have put...
Ms Hockey, we don't need to have the sedentary chit-chat. Mr Hoy, please. And that would apply also to Mr Simpson.
OK, well, let's
Mr Hoy, please continue.
Let's look at Mr Brown's shocking attempt to dodge scrutiny. The committee's draft report concluded the lack of cooperation we experienced from the former Cabinet Secretary for Investment, Infrastructure and Cities is also a matter of serious concern. Yeah. Mr Beattie's response to argue that we should hit the delete key again. Now look, Mr Leonard also proposed additional wording to reflect that CMAL's negotiating position was almost certainly weakened by the public announcement of the preferred bidder, as CMAL itself said to us. The conclusion that we reached in draft form is reasonable, and I quote, "The committee is not convinced that such a public announcement was necessary or indeed appropriate for this project, especially at a time given the considerable work and negotiation that was required before CMAL could take a decision to award the formal contract. We believe that this almost certainly weakened CMAL's negotiating position with FML." Mr Beattie's response, again, to try and hit the delete key. But SNP members didn't stop there in their attempts to whitewash the report on behalf of the ministers. The report draft stated, "It also remains unclear why the First Minister led on the preferred bidder announcement and why the First Minister's press release and associated social media communications did not reflect that there were significant negotiations to be concluded." Again, SNP members disagreed, voting in vain to try and remove this passage. And they were similarly obstructive when it came to following the money. On the use of the £10 million loan to FML, the report's conclusion was clear. The committee considers that transparency over the use of public money is essential. This example falls, we said, well short of the standards of transparency we would expect. Isn't it strange that a member of the Scottish Parliament's Public Audit Committee, and at that stage also a treasurer of the SNP, could take issue with such a conclusion? Perhaps now we know why there was such an absence of financial control that allowed the SNP to sneak a motorhome onto its books without, apparently, the knowledge of its very own treasurer. And when it came to the meeting between the First Minister and Jim McCall, a meeting where the recollections of the two protagonists differ significantly, again there was an SNP attempt to neuter the committee. The report concludes, record and note-keeping of these meetings was weak and fell well short of the standards of transparency and accountability that we would expect. It continues, it is particularly concerning that there does not appear to be a full record of the meeting held between the former director of FML and the First Minister in May 2017. And it concludes, a permanent civil servant should have attended and produced a record of that meeting in line with the established protocols in the Scottish Ministerial Code. Deputy Presiding Officer, yet again, Willie, Coffey and Colin Beattie sought to play down criticism of this government by seeking to remove elements of this clear account of that evidence session. I don't have time. In the end, thankfully, their attempts to divert, to dilute, to distract and delete legitimate criticism of the government did not succeed, and the report stands as a very solid piece of work, and I thank my colleagues for that. But the SNP did not only seek to attempt to amend the report, they also sought to undermine the report. Upon its publication, a statement was released by Mr Coffey and Mr Beattie through an SNP spokesman. It said, "The headlines chased by the committee convener significantly embellish the actual substance of the report, which offers very little in the way of new information." For the record, I disagree with this view entirely, and I support the convener in his conclusion that the people of Scotland have been badly let down by SNP ministers. Deputy Presiding Officer, having reviewed 16 hours of scrutiny and thousands of pages of evidence, only a lame lapdog or a lackey could have come to a different conclusion. The Public Audit Committee's verdict on the SNP's long-running ferries fiasco was fair and proportionate, and our report identifies a series of failures on an unprecedented scale.